Now, don't worry, my pet, Mrs. Whatsit said cheerfully. We took care of that before we left. Your mother has had enough to worry her with you and Charles to cope with, and not knowing about your father without adding to her anxieties. We took a time wrinkle as well as a space wrinkle. It's very easy to do if you just know how. What do you mean? Meg asked plaintively. Please, Mrs. Whatsit, it's all so confusing. Just relax and don't worry over things that needn't trouble you, Mrs. Whatsit said. We made a nice, tidy little time tester, and unless something goes terribly wrong, we'll have you back about 5 minutes before you left. So there'll be time to spare, and nobody will ever need to know you were gone at all. Though, of course, you'll be telling your mother, dear lamb, that she is. And if something goes terribly wrong, it won't matter whether we ever get back at all. Don't frighten them, Mrs. Witch's voice came. Are you losing faith? Oh, no, I'm not. But Meg thought her voice sounded a little faint. I hope this is a nice planet, Calvin said. We can't see much of it. Does it ever clear up? Meg looked around her, realizing that she had been so breathless from the journey and the stop on the two-dimensional planet that she had not noticed her surroundings. And perhaps this was not very surprising, for the main thing about the surrounding was exactly that they were unnoticeable. They seemed to be standing on some kind of nondescript flat surface. The air around them was gray. It was not exactly fog, but she could see nothing through it. Visibility was limited to the nicely definite bodies of Charles, Wallace, and Calvin, the rather unbelievable bodies of Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who, and a faint occasional glimmer that was Mrs. Witch. Come, children, Mrs. Whatsit said. We don't have far to go, and we might as well walk. It will do you good to stretch your legs a little. As they moved through the grayness, Meg caught an occasional glimpse of slag-like rocks, but there were no traces of trees or bushes. Nothing but flat ground under their feet, no sign of any vegetation at all. Finally, ahead of them, there loomed what seemed to be a hill of stone. As they approached it, Meg could see that there was an entrance that led into a deep, dark cavern. Are we going in there? She asked nervously. Don't be afraid, Mrs. Whatsit said. It's easier for the happy medium to work within. Oh, you'll like her, children. She's very jolly. If ever I saw her looking unhappy, I would be very depressed myself. As long as she can laugh, I'm sure everything is going to come out right in the end. Mrs. Whatsit, came Mrs. Witch's voice severely. Just because you are very young is no excuse for talking too much. Mrs. Whatsit looked hurt, but she subsided. Just how old are you? Calvin asked her. Just a moment, Mrs. Whatsit murmured, and appeared to calculate rapidly upon her fingers. She nodded triumphantly. Exactly 2,379,152,497 years, 8 months and 3 days. That is according to your calendar, of course, which even you know isn't very accurate. She leaned closer to Meg and Calvin and whispered, It was really a very great honor for me to be chosen for this mission. It's just because of my verbalizing and materializing so well, you know? But of course, we can't take any credit for our talents. It's how we use them that counts. And I make far too many mistakes. That's why Mrs. Who and I enjoyed seeing Mrs. Witch make a mistake when she tried to land you on the two-dimensional planet. It was that we were laughing at, not at you. She was laughing at herself too, you see. She's really terribly nice to us younger ones. Meg was listening with such interest to what Mrs. Whatsit was saying that she hardly noticed when they went into the cave the transition from the grayness of outside to the grayness of inside was almost unnoticeable. She saw a flickering light ahead of them, ahead and down, and it was toward this that they went. As they drew closer, she realized that it was a fire. "It gets very cold in here," Mrs. Whatsit said, "so we asked her to have a good bonfire going for you." As they approached the fire, they could see a dark shadow against it, and as they went closer still, they could see that the shadow was a woman. She wore a turban of beautiful pale mauve silk and a long flowing purple satin gown. In her hands was a crystal ball into which she was gazing raptly. She did not appear to see the children, Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Witch, but continued to stare into the crystal ball. And as she stared, she began to laugh, and she laughed and laughed at whatever it was that she was seeing. Mrs. Witch's voice rang out clear and strong, echoing against the walls of the cavern, and the words fell with a sonorous clang. "We are here." The woman looked up from the ball, and when she saw them, she got up and curtsied deeply. Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who dropped small curtsies in return, and the shimmer seemed to bow slightly. "Oh, medium dear," Mrs. Whatsit said, "these are the children. Charles Wallace Murray." Charles Wallace bowed. Margaret Murray. Meg felt that if Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who had curtsied, she ought to also. So she did, rather awkwardly. And Calvin O'Keefe. Calvin bobbed his head. "We want them to see their home planet," Mrs. Whatsit said. The medium lost the delighted smile she had worn till then. "Oh, why must you make me look at unpleasant things when there are so many delightful ones to see?" Again, Mrs. Witch's voice reverberated through the cave. "There will no longer be so many pleasant things to look at if responsible people do not do something about the unpleasant ones." The medium sighed and held the ball high. "Look, children," Mrs. Whatsit said, "look into it well. Que la terre est petite à qui la voit sous. Dalil, how small is the earth to him who looks from heaven." Mrs. Who intoned musically. Meg looked into the crystal ball, at first with caution, then with increasing eagerness, as she seemed to see an enormous sweep of dark and empty space, and then galaxies swinging across it. Finally, they seemed to move in close on one of the galaxies. "Your own Milky Way," Mrs. Whatsit whispered to Meg. They were headed directly toward the center of the galaxy. Then they moved off to one side. Stars seemed to be rushing at them. Meg flung her arm up over her face as though to ward off the blow. "Look," Mrs. Witch commanded. Meg dropped her arm. They seemed to be moving in toward a planet. She thought she could make out polar ice caps. Everything seemed sparkling clear. No, medium dear, that's Mars," Mrs. Whatsit reproved gently. "Do I have to?" the medium asked. "Now," Mrs. Witch commanded. The bright planet moved out of their vision. For a moment, there was the darkness of space, then another planet. The outlines of this planet were not clean and clear. It seemed to be covered with a smoky haze. Through the haze, Meg thought she could make out the familiar outlines of continents, like pictures in her social studies books. "Is it because of our atmosphere that we can't see properly?" she asked anxiously. "No, Meg, you know that it is not the atmosphere," Mrs. Witch said. "You must be brave." "It's the thing," Charles Wallace cried. "It's the dark thing we saw from the mountain peak on Uriel when we were riding on Mrs. Whatsit's back." Did it just come? Meg asked in agony, unable to take her eyes from the sickness of the shadow which darkened the beauty of the earth. Did it just come while we've been gone? Mrs. Witch's voice seemed very tired. Tell her, she said to Mrs. Whatsit. Mrs. Whatsit sighed. No, Meg, it hasn't just come. It has been there for a great many years. That is why your planet is such a troubled one. But why? Calvin started to ask, his voice croaking hoarsely. Mrs. Whatsit raised her hand to silence him. We showed you the dark thing on Uriel first. Oh, for many reasons. First, because the atmosphere on the mountain peaks there is so clear and thin, you could see it for what it is. And we thought it would be easier for you to understand it if you saw it. Well, someplace else. First, not your own earth. I hate it, Charles Wallace cried passionately. I hate the dark thing. Mrs. Whatsit nodded. Yes, Charles, dear, we all do. That's another reason we wanted to prepare you on Uriel. We thought it would be too frightening for you to see it first of all about your own beloved world. But what is it? Calvin demanded. We know that it's evil, but what is it? You have said it. Mrs. Witch's voice rang out. It is evil. It is the powers of darkness. But what's going to happen? Meg's voice trembled. Oh, please, Mrs. Witch, tell us what's going to happen. We will continue to fight. Something in Mrs. Witch's voice made all three of the children stand straighter, throwing back their shoulders with determination, looking at the glimmer that was Mrs. Witch with pride and confidence. And we're not alone, you know, children, came Mrs. Whatsit, the comforter. All through the universe, it's being fought, all through the cosmos. And but it's a grand and exciting battle. I know it's hard for you to understand about size, how there's very little difference in the size of the tiniest microbe and the greatest galaxy. You think about that, and maybe it won't seem strange to you that some of our very best fighters have come right from your own planet, and it's a little planet, dears, out on the edge of a little galaxy. You can be proud that it's done so well. Who have our fighters been? Calvin asked. Oh, you must know them, dear, Mrs. Whatsit said. Mrs. Whose spectacles shone out at them triumphantly. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Jesus? Charles Wallace said. Why, of course, Jesus. Of course, Mrs. Whatsit said. Go on, Charles, love. There were others, all your great artists. They've been lights for us to see by. Leonardo da Vinci, Calvin suggested tentatively. And Michelangelo? And Shakespeare, Charles Wallace called out. And Bach? And Pasteur? And Madame Curie? And Einstein? Now Calvin's voice rang with confidence. And Schweitzer? And Gandhi? And Buddha? And Beethoven? And Rembrandt? And St. Francis? Now you, Meg, Mrs. Whatsit ordered. Oh, Euclid, I should suppose. Meg was in such an agony of impatience that her voice grated irritably. And Copernicus. But what about Father? Please, what about Father? We are going to your father, Mrs. Witch said. But where is he? Meg went over to Mrs. Witch and stamped as though she were as young as Charles Wallace. Mrs. Whatsit answered in a voice that was low but quite firm. On a planet that has given in. So you must prepare to be very strong. All traces of cheer had left the happy medium's face. She sat holding the great ball, looking down at the shadowed earth, and a slow tear coursed down her cheek. I can't stand it any longer, she sobbed. Watch now, children, watch.